Qantas has posted a $1.7 billion loss for the financial year. COVID-19 border closures have cost the airline a total of $16 billion in revenues so far. But Qantas CEO Alan Joyce is optimistic that international travel can resume by the end of the year. Our business editor Ross Greenwood spoke to Mr Joyce earlier today. He asked what Qantas will do if some states don't adopt that 80% vaccination target.
Well, hopefully we won't get there, Ross, because every Premier has signed up to the national plan and national cabinet, and they've all agreed that this is the way to go. But my question to them is, if we don't open up at the 80%, what are we looking for? How can we open up? What's the alternative? Are we going to remain a hermit nation forever? I don't think that would be fair to the population, the people. And this week we launched a very emotional ad to talk about people reuniting around the world and doing what they did prior to COVID. And the reaction to that was been phenomenal. And it shows that I think the population want to see an end of this, a path out of this, and they want to have hope for the future. And opening up the borders once we get to 80%, I think is something that they've committed to the general population. It's something that they need to deliver on.
Okay, I do also note today you talked about non-stop flights from the UK to Australia. Now, this has been a big thing for you. They were originally planned to arrive in Perth, but you now say they could arrive in Darwin. Are you worried about WA Premier Mark McGowan's attitude?
Well, we have to hope for the best and plan for the worst. So we think that the UK will be a very good market for us when the borders open up. And the UK have gotten to very high levels of vaccination. And we think by Christmas that should be one of the markets that's being considered as a bubble. And therefore we want to have an option, and we'd love to go back and do the Perth-London, but if that's not feasible, of course we're going to have a look at all alternatives. And Darwin, we have been operating from Darwin to Frankfurt, to Paris, to London, lots of London flights. So we've got good operational experiences of doing it from there. So we're keeping all of our options open.
Well, are you effectively saying to Mark McGowan, if you buck that national cabinet, you will not get the benefit of these direct flights from London? They will go to Darwin.
Well, what we're saying is that Qantas will figure ways of operating and managing the circumstances we see at the time, and there are other options, and there's not all our eggs aren't in one basket, and we have to continue to do that. But I think, you know, people would be unbelievably disappointed if you can go and visit your relatives in London and the UK for Christmas, but can't go and visit your relatives in Perth. So I don't think that's going to happen, but we just have to have an alternative plan if it did happen, and this is what we're putting in place.
Okay, so initially you'll fly to COVID-safe destinations, the UK, US, Canada, Singapore and Japan. How many flights do you envisage will start from mid-December, and from how many ports will you send those flights?
Yeah, it's a lot lower than the schedule we had pre-COVID. So, for example, to the United States, we will have 2 flights a day, a daily from Sydney, and flights 4 days a week from Melbourne and 3 days a week from Brisbane. Now, that's a lot less than we had before COVID. We had nearly 7 flights a day on certain days going to the United States. And to London, we're thinking we could justify potentially 2 flights there a day. So it starts off relatively small. It's around 30% of our pre-COVID capacity levels, and it gradually builds up as more markets open up and people get comfortable with travelling again. So we're hoping by the end of the financial year, that's by the time we get to July, we're around 70% of pre-COVID levels.
Okay, but there's also 20 airlines now who have said that they're not flying into Sydney at the moment. Now, given the fact you're not at your pre-COVID levels, yet the demand we know is going to be white hot, what does that say for airline prices and the ability for ordinary Australians to be able to afford to travel to go and see those loved ones overseas?
Yeah, Ross, and the airfares we think will still be extremely low, like they have been domestically, to get people to travel again. So at the moment in mid-January, because we're on sale, you have airfares to London that are $1,800, to Los Angeles $1,600, which are very similar to what they were pre-COVID. So we don't see the airfares going to extraordinarily high levels. And we do think by the middle of the year there's going to be a lot more demand. So that's why we also also made the announcement today that we're reactivating 5 of the A380s earlier than planned, and we'll have them coming into operation to meet the demand on the UK and the US by the middle of next year. And we have flexibility on another 5 to introduce them by early 24. If the demand exceeds our expectations, we can activate a lot more aircraft to make sure we meet the demand from the Australian public. Okay,
but high-risk areas where there's high rates of COVID, low rates of vaccination, Bali, Jakarta, Ho Chi Minh City, Johannesburg, they've been put back to April. Do you think, again, there's wriggle room there? Does it depend literally on the situation on the ground?
It does, Ross, and we're saying it's at the earliest April of next year for those destinations. And I think the framework that the government has talked about in this National Cabinet 4-phase plan is that those countries would have to get to the 70 to 80% vaccination levels that we have in Australia in order for us to have more freedom and travel bubbles between them. So a lot depends on how the rollout happens in those countries. So we're continuing to maintain flexibility on that.
Can I just go to the airline itself? The loss, $1.7 billion. Your debt currently $3.9 billion, but you do have $3.8 billion of cash on hand. What sort of shape is Qantas in now to survive all of this?
I think we're in really good shape. We're performing a lot better than most airlines around the globe. We've probably been the most impacted company in Australia. We're going to lose $20 billion in revenue as a consequence of COVID by the end of this year. But we've taken the necessary action to get through this. Unfortunately, we've had to make 10,000 people nearly redundant to restructure the business so that when we come out of it, we can pay back those debt levels fast. We've raised $1.4 billion in equity to do that restructuring, and our shareholders are very supportive. The Qantas share price still is performing relatively strong compared to most airlines around the globe. And we've raised over $2.8 billion in new debt to give us that liquidity to make sure we have enough runway to get through this crisis. And we now see light at the end of the tunnel. And Ross, when the borders did open up domestically for that last quarter of the last financial year, we saw a massive surge in demand, and we were able to pay down. We had net free cash flows of nearly $500 million in that last quarter that helped us pay down that debt. That's a sample of what this business can produce once the borders open up domestically, and when they open up internationally, we'll be firing on all cylinders.
You have cut costs. 9,400 people have lost their jobs at Qantas. There's another 8,500 now currently stood down. With the reintroduction of international flying, when do you expect to see that 8,500 stood down workers back at work?
So 2,500 of them are domestic workers. So once the domestic borders open up, which we are hopeful it'll be by Christmas, they will be back to work. And then for the international employees, they will be gradually put back to work as we reactivate the aircraft, and particularly the A380s. When we get the 5 aircraft back in operation, which will be in the middle of 22, all employees will be back to work. We will have to get some of the employees, a lot of them back earlier than that, to do the training to get them ready for it. So that's our plan, as long as we can see the borders opening up in line with what we're predicting today.